when I discovered our HOA president had hired a fake police force with K-9 units to terrorize residents. I knew I had to act fast before someone got hurt, but I never expected my dad, the chief of police, to uncover a web of corruption that would shake our entire community to its core. What would you do if you found out the people claiming to protect your neighborhood were actually criminals with badges? Welcome to my channel. Comment below where you're watching from. The bright orange paper fluttering on my front door stopped me in my tracks. After a 12-hour shift at the hospital, all I wanted was to surprise Sarah by helping with her new vegetable garden. But that notice changed everything. My hands shook as I read the words, "Immediate action required," stamped across the top in bold black letters. I'd heard stories about Barbara Thompson, our HOA president, from other neighbors. She'd moved in 6 months ago and somehow got herself elected within weeks. The way she wrote our address on the violation notice, pressing so hard the pen nearly tore through the paper, told me everything I needed to know about her personality. Unapproved landscaping modifications detected in backyard space. The notice read, "Immediate removal required. All garden installations must undergo proper HOA review process." At the bottom, Barbara's signature sprawled across the page like she was signing a royal decree, but it was the last line that made my stomach turn. "Security will conduct regular inspections to ensure compliance." Since when did our quiet, suburban community need security? Inspections for vegetable gardens? Sarah and I had moved here 3 months ago, drawn by the friendly neighbors and peaceful streets. Mrs. Patterson, next door, had even brought us homemade cookies to welcome us. Now this? I pulled out my phone and took pictures of both sides of the notice. Something about the wording felt off, like it was trying too hard to sound official. I'd learned from my dad to always document everything, just in case. Being the son of a police chief teaches you a few things about dealing with authority, real or fake. Inside, I found Sarah humming in the kitchen, soil still fresh under her fingernails from working in our small garden. Her smile faded as I handed her the notice. "But we checked the HOA guidelines," she said, pulling up the community website on her tablet. "Right here, Article 7, vegetable gardens permitted in backyard spaces with proper drainage." I watched as she highlighted the relevant sections, her environmental lawyer instincts kicking in. We'd done everything right, installed proper drainage, kept it small and neat, even used the recommended height for raised beds. The tomato plants were barely visible from any angle outside our yard. The doorbell rang, making us both jump. Through the peephole, I saw Barbara herself, tapping her foot impatiently on our welcome mat. She wore a crisp white pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, a tablet clutched in her manicured hands like a weapon. "I want to make sure you received my notice," she announced when I opened the door, not bothering with a greeting. Her eyes darted past me, trying to peek inside our house. "The board has received complaints about your agricultural activities. Would you mind showing me these complaints?" I asked calmly, remembering Dad's advice about staying professional in tense situations. "And could you clarify which specific HOA guidelines we've violated?" Barbara's face tightened. "Our new security team will be documenting all violations starting tomorrow. I suggest you comply quickly to avoid complications." She turned on her heel, but not before I noticed something odd. A logo on her tablet case that looked suspiciously like a police badge. As I closed the door, Sarah was already pulling up property maps and local ordinances on her laptop. "Look at this," she whispered, pointing to the HOA board meeting minutes from last month. "They never voted on hiring any security team. Where is she getting the authority for this?" I stared out our kitchen window at the neat rows of vegetables Sarah had lovingly planted. Something bigger was happening here, and that orange notice was just the beginning. I picked up my phone to call Dad, then stopped. Maybe it was too soon to involve him. But as I watched Barbara stride down our street, stopping to take photos of other homes with her tablet, I couldn't shake the feeling that our quiet community was about to change forever. I was drinking my morning coffee when I first spotted them through our kitchen window. 2 men in black polo shirts with HOA security printed on the back were taking photos of our vegetable garden. Their movements were different from regular HOA inspectors, more aggressive, more purposeful. What really caught my eye were the tactical belts they wore, loaded with what looked like real police gear. Sarah was still asleep upstairs when I stepped onto our back porch. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the unease growing in my stomach. The taller one turned, hand resting on what appeared to be a real police-issue taser. His partner kept photographing our tomato plants, like they were evidence at a crime scene. "We have police authority within this community," the tall one said, flashing a badge that looked official but disappeared too quickly for me to read it. "We're documenting ongoing violations under HOA Code 47B. He spoke with the confidence of someone used to not being questioned. I pulled out my phone and started recording, which made them both visibly uncomfortable. "I'd like to see your credentials and documentation of this police authority," I said, remembering the legal rights pamphlet I'd read just last week. The shorter one stepped forward, but his partner held him back. That's when Barbara Thompson appeared, as if she'd been waiting in the wings. She marched across our lawn in her designer workout gear, waving another orange violation notice. "These officers don't answer to residents," she announced, clearly enjoying the drama. "They report directly to the HOA executive board, which means they report to me." I noticed our neighbor, Mrs. Patel, peeking through her curtains. When our eyes met, she quickly disappeared. But not before I saw the fear on her face. Something about that look made my skin crawl. Later that morning, while reviewing my phone footage, I noticed details I'd missed in the moment. The officers had no name tags. Their badges didn't match any local law enforcement design I'd ever seen. And the equipment on their belts, it looked real. But something was off about the positioning. I spent my lunch break researching private security regulations in our state. Every legitimate company needed specific licenses and permits, especially if they were carrying weapons. The HOA newsletter had mentioned hiring enhanced security, but there was no company name. No license numbers, nothing that could be verified. Sarah came downstairs just as I was emailing the state licensing board. "Why are there men with guns taking pictures of our garden?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. I showed her the footage from that morning, and her face went pale. "Those aren't regular security guards," she said. "I used to work at a security company, remember? Their gear is all wrong." We watched through our windows as the officers moved down the street, stopping at each house with meticulous precision. They spent extra time at the homes of residents who'd spoken up at recent HOA meetings. The Rodriguez family, who'd complained about discriminatory enforcement of noise regulations. The Smiths, who'd questioned the new security fee on their monthly statement. That evening, I created a private group chat with trusted neighbors. Messages started pouring in immediately. The security team had been entering backyards without permission. They'd been taking photos of children playing. They'd even threatened to detain someone for washing their car in their own driveway. As I compiled everyone's stories and evidence, my phone buzzed with a text from Barbara. "Your continued surveillance of our security team is a violation of HOA policy. Expect enforcement action tomorrow." The threat was clear, but she'd made a crucial mistake in trying to intimidate us. She'd confirmed what we suspected. These men weren't real police officers at all. I looked at Sarah, who was already pulling up the state's laws about impersonating law enforcement. "We need to be really careful," she whispered. "If they're willing to pretend to be cops, who knows what else they're willing to do?" The growing stack of evidence on our kitchen table suggested we'd only scratched the surface of what was really going on in our neighborhood. My phone buzzed during a crucial work meeting. Sarah's name flashed on the screen. She never calls during work hours. Something was wrong. I stepped out, my hands already sweating as I answered. "They're in our backyard," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "3 of them. They jumped our fence while I was picking tomatoes." I heard male voices in the background, angry and demanding. My wife's breathing got faster. Through the phone, I could hear heavy boots on our wooden deck. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. Exit the garden now." The voice was trying to sound official, but there was something off about it. "We have authorization to remove you by force." "I'm not leaving my own property," Sarah said firmly, but I could hear the fear in her voice. "Show me your real police badges or leave now." The sound of a radio crackling made my stomach drop. "Unit 2, subject is non-compliant. Requesting K-9 backup at 1242 Maple Drive." I was already running to my car, my tie whipping in the wind. "Sarah, I'm on my way. Don't move. Call 911 right now. These aren't real cops." Through the phone, I heard Barbara's shrill voice. "Mrs. Williams, your garden is a direct violation of HOA Aesthetic Guidelines Section 4.3. My security team has full authority to remove unauthorized plantings and trespassers." "Trespassers?" Sarah's voice rose in disbelief. "I live here, and those tomato plants are in our backyard." I put the phone on speaker as I sped home, breaking every speed limit. Sarah kept the line open, and each sound made my heart race faster. The click of a weapon being unfastened. Heavy footsteps approaching. Barbara's smug voice listing violations. "Look what I found," one of the security men said. Hispanic-style peppers. Definitely not approved vegetation. "They're jalapenos!" Sarah shouted. "Since when do vegetables have ethnic restrictions?" I heard our garden gate creak. The one I'd installed just last weekend. More boots on gravel. Someone yanking at plants. "Stop touching our property," Sarah yelled. "My husband's already called the real police." Barbara's laugh sent chills down my spine. "Dear, we are the police in this community. The HOA charter gives us full authority. Now step aside or my men will remove you. The sound of a dog barking in the distance made my blood run cold. They were really bringing in K-9 units for a vegetable garden dispute? I switched lanes aggressively, drawing angry honks. 5 more minutes. Just 5 more minutes. This is what happens when you ignore warnings, Barbara said. First the unapproved plants, then the unauthorized garden stakes, and now resisting HOA security? You people need to learn respect for authority. You people? Sarah's voice was quiet but strong. I heard her phone camera clicking. Please say that again, Barbara. I'm recording everything. The sound of scrambling feet, Barbara's sharp intake of breath. Confiscate that phone. It's against HOA policy to record security operations. I heard Sarah scream as someone grabbed at her. The phone clattered to the ground but stayed connected. Through the speaker, I heard the growing rumble of a large dog's growl getting closer. Barbara Thompson, Sarah shouted. If that dog touches me, you'll be in handcuffs before sunset. I was 2 blocks away when I heard sirens, but they weren't coming from the direction of the local police station. A black SUV with K-9 unit markings screeched to a halt in front of our house. The fake police force was escalating, but they had no idea they were about to meet a real chief of police. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I'd seen power-hungry HOA boards before, but this was something else entirely. As I turned onto our street, I saw the crowd gathering, neighbors with phones raised, recording everything. Barbara's security team had finally gone too far, and now everyone would see exactly who they really were. My tires screeched as I pulled into our driveway, and what I saw made my heart stop. Sarah was backed against our front door, her gardening gloves still on, dirt smudged on her cheek. 3 men in tactical gear had formed a half circle around her, while Barbara stood off to the side with a clipboard, writing furiously. But what really made my hands shake was the German Shepherd, pulling hard against its leash, teeth bared. The handler, a guy who looked barely old enough to drink, was struggling to control the dog. These weren't just rent-a-cops, playing dress-up anymore. This was dangerous. Step back inside your vehicle, sir. One of the security officers barked, trying to sound official. His hand rested on what looked like a real police belt. But something was off about his badge. I'd grown up around real police equipment thanks to Dad, and this wasn't it. Barbara's face lit up with that familiar smug smile when she saw me. Perfect timing. Your wife has been interfering with official HOA security operations. She waved her clipboard like it was some kind of royal decree. We have documented 17 violations, including aggressive behavior toward our officers. I took out my phone and started recording. Barbara's smile faltered for a split second. Putting unauthorized recordings on social media is against HOA guidelines. She snapped, but I could hear the worry in her voice. Funny thing about those guidelines, I said, keeping my voice steady like Dad taught me. I've read them cover to cover. Nowhere does it mention a private police force or K-9 units. The youngest officer shifted uncomfortably, his hand dropping from his belt. Sarah caught my eye and I gave her a slight nod. She'd been recording too, her phone partially hidden by her gardening apron. We'd talked about this possibility after the first time these guys showed up, and now our security cameras were catching everything from 3 different angles. This is your final warning, Barbara declared, but her voice had lost some of its edge. Remove the unauthorized vegetables immediately, or we'll be forced to take additional enforcement action. The German Shepherd barked, making Sarah jump. That's when I noticed something that made my blood boil. The dog's vest said Police K-9, a federal offense if they weren't actual law enforcement. I could almost hear Dad's voice in my head listing all the laws they were breaking. Barbara, I said calmly, pulling up the state police department's website on my phone. Did you know impersonating law enforcement officers is a felony? Those uniforms, that dog's vest, those fake badges. Each one is a separate charge. The security team started exchanging nervous glances. The dog handler's grip on the leash tightened, his knuckles turning white. Barbara's face flushed red, but she kept writing on her clipboard like it was some kind of shield. We have full authority to enforce HOA regulations, she insisted, but her voice cracked. The board approved everything. Really? I reached into my car and pulled out the folder I'd been collecting. Because I have here the minutes from every board meeting for the past year. Nowhere does it mention hiring armed security or approving K-9 units. I turned to the youngest officer. By the way, what's your certification number for handling that police dog? The handler's face went pale. The German Shepherd, picking up on his anxiety, started whining. Barbara's pen froze mid-sentence on her clipboard. Sarah, I called out, keeping my eyes on the security team. Could you grab Dad's card from my wallet? I think he'd be very interested in seeing these gentlemen's law enforcement credentials. That's when Barbara made her fatal mistake. Detain them both, she shrieked, her clipboard clattering to the ground. They're threatening HOA personnel. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone, but I managed to type out a quick text to my dad. Emergency at house. Fake cops threatening Sarah with dog. Please help. I kept my phone low, pretending to check my work schedule while Barbara ranted about our garden violating some made-up rule about aesthetic cohesion. The lead security guy kept his hand on the German Shepherd's harness, making sure we could see how eager the dog was to leap forward. Sarah stood her ground, but I could see her terror. She'd been bitten by a dog as a kid and never quite got over that fear. That's exactly what these bullies were counting on. I checked my phone every few seconds, trying not to be obvious. Dad had read my message. 3 dots appeared as he typed. My heart was racing. In 20 years as chief of police, he'd seen every kind of scam and power trip imaginable. But this was personal. Barbara was getting louder, waving some kind of official-looking document in Sarah's face. As per Section 8, Paragraph 12 of our enhanced security protocols, she started, but I cut her off. Could you show me where the HOA board approved these protocols? I asked calmly. That threw her for a loop. The security team leader, his fake badge, said. Captain Reynolds stepped forward. Sir, you're interfering with a sanctioned HOA operation, he growled, letting the dog pull forward just a little bit more. I noticed his hand was shaking slightly. These guys were amateurs playing dress-up, but that made them even more dangerous. Just then I heard it, the faint sound of sirens in the distance. Barbara was too busy reading from her rulebook to notice, but Captain Reynolds' head snapped up. He knew that sound meant trouble. The other 2 security guys started shifting nervously. The sirens got louder. One of the fake officers touched his earpiece, probably just for show, since I doubted they could afford real radio equipment. Maybe we should, he started to say, but Barbara whirled on him. Don't you dare back down now! I'm paying you good money to show these people who's in charge. That's when the first real police car rounded the corner, lights flashing. Then another, and another. The look on Barbara's face was priceless as 5 patrol cars surrounded my house, cutting off any escape route. The German Shepherd, sensing the shift in power, sat down and whined. Dad stepped out of the lead car, and I've never been so proud to be his son. He wasn't wearing his usual business suit. He was in full chief of police uniform, badge gleaming. He'd clearly been in a meeting when he got my text, but he didn't waste a second responding. Barbara Thompson? He called out, his voice carrying that special tone that only comes from decades of real police work. I'm Chief Anderson. Would you care to explain why you have unauthorized personnel impersonating law enforcement officers on private property? Barbara's face went through about 5 different expressions in 3 seconds. Confusion, recognition, fear, anger, and finally panic. She looked at me, then at Dad, then back at me. The pieces clicked together in her head. The security team tried to back away, but Dad's officers had already formed a perimeter. The German Shepherd, proving it had more sense than its handlers, lay down and rolled over, tail wagging at the real police K-9 unit that had just arrived. I can explain everything, Barbara stammered. But Dad held up his hand. I'm sure you can, ma'am. We'll have plenty of time for that down at the station. Right now, I'm more interested in where these gentlemen got their equipment and credentials. He turned to the fake security team. Speaking of which, those badges look remarkably similar to official police identification. That's a federal offense, gentlemen. As Dad's officers began taking statements and collecting evidence, neighbors started peeking out of their houses. Some had phones out, recording everything. Barbara's little empire of fear was crumbling, and the whole community was watching it happen. I pulled Sarah close, feeling her finally relax as the real police took control of the situation. Your dad, she whispered, squeezing my hand. He didn't just bring backup. He brought justice. The screech of police sirens filled our street as my dad's cruiser pulled up. Lights flashing. Barbara's smirk vanished when she saw the chief of police emblem on the door. I'll never forget how her face changed from confident to terrified in seconds. Dad stepped out, his police uniform catching the afternoon sun. The fake security team's German Shepherd suddenly sat quiet, as if it knew a real authority figure had arrived. 20 years as chief of police had given my father a presence that no fake badge could match. I'd like to see your security licenses and K-9 unit certifications, Dad said calmly, his voice carrying across our front yard. The 3 security officers looked at each other, their tough guy act crumbling. The one holding the dog's leash started backing away. Barbara jumped in, waving a folder of papers. We have all the necessary HOA authorizations right here, she said, her voice higher than usual. These officers are fully within their rights to enforce our community guidelines. Dad took the folder but didn't open it. Instead, he pulled out his phone and showed Barbara something on the screen. Interesting, he said, because according to state records, There's no licensed security company registered under your HOA's name. And that K-9 unit? The closest authorized police dog training facility hasn't certified any private security dogs in 2 years. The color drained from Barbara's face. The security team leader, a tall man with a buzz cut who'd been so intimidating moments before, now couldn't seem to look anyone in the eye. 2 real police officers approached him, and I noticed his hand trembling as he tried to keep hold of the dog's leash. "Sir," one of Dad's officers said, "that's department-issued gear you're wearing. Mind telling me where you got it?" The security team leader remained silent, sweat visible on his forehead. More neighbors had gathered on their porches, watching the scene unfold. I saw phones recording everything. Sarah squeezed my hand as Dad walked over to the security team's car, shining his flashlight through the windows. "Well, what do we have here?" Dad called out. In the back seat were folders with photos, dozens of them. Pictures of families in their backyards, children playing, residents simply living their lives. My stomach turned as I realized how long they'd been watching us all. Barbara tried to slip away during the commotion, but a young officer blocked her path. "Ma'am, impersonating law enforcement officers is a federal offense," he said. "And using an unauthorized K-9 unit to threaten civilians? That's going to require some explaining." The dog, seeming to sense its handler's distress, had gone from aggressive to confused. A real K-9 unit arrived, and the difference was obvious. The HOA's dog had none of the discipline or training of a real police dog. Dad turned to address the growing crowd of neighbors. "If anyone has had encounters with these individuals, we'll need statements," he announced. Hands shot up across the street. The Rodriguez family from next door stepped forward first, then the Patels from across the street. "They threatened to have my children removed by social services for playing basketball in our driveway," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice shaking with anger and relief. As real police officers began taking statements, I watched Barbara sink into the back of a patrol car, still clutching her HOA rulebook. The security team was being cuffed, their fake badges and gear confiscated. Their German Shepherd, now revealed as just an untrained dog used to scare people, was being gently led away by the real K-9 unit officer. Sarah walked over to my dad, giving him a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered. Dad just nodded, but I could see the anger in his eyes as he looked through more of the surveillance, photos from the security team's car. A news van pulled up at the end of our street. Barbara saw it through the patrol car window and finally broke down crying. But they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of someone who was finally facing consequences for their actions. Real justice was about to begin, and our peaceful community would never be the same. As I watched more neighbors coming forward to share their stories, I realized this was bigger than just our house or our garden. This was about standing up to bullies who hide behind fake authority and made-up rules. The morning after the arrests, my dad called me into his office at the police station. Spread across his desk were stacks of papers, HOA financial records, security contracts, and hundreds of photos taken of our neighbors. My stomach turned as I saw pictures of children playing, families having dinner on their patios, and timestamps showing round-the-clock surveillance. "Son, this goes deeper than we thought," Dad said, sliding a document toward me. It was a bank statement showing monthly payments of $15,000 to a company called Community Guardian Services. The real HOA budget only allowed for $2,000 in security expenses. Where was the extra money coming from? I helped Dad dig through more records. Barbara had been charging special assessment fees to families who received violation notices. The more we looked, the worse it got. The Rodriguez family had paid $3,000 in security deposits after their birthday party incident. The Patels were charged extra maintenance fees for their vegetable garden. The fake security team's background checks revealed even more shocking details. None of them had real law enforcement training. Their leader, Mike Stevens, had been fired from 3 different police departments for excessive force. The K-9 unit wasn't even a trained police dog. It was Stevens' personal pet that he used to scare residents. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. She'd been talking to Mrs. Patel, who shared videos of the security team rifling through her mailbox last month. Other neighbors started sending evidence too. Ring doorbell footage, cell phone videos, written threats from Barbara. Each piece of evidence made my blood boil more. Dad's detective, Lisa Martinez, burst into the office waving a document. "Chief, we found their training manual. The pages detailed how to target specific residents, what times to photograph families, and even scripts for threatening people who questioned their authority." Barbara's handwritten notes in the margins made it clear. This wasn't about security. It was about control. The investigation revealed Barbara had a history of power abuse. She'd run similar schemes in 2 other communities before moving here. Both times, She'd left just as people started asking questions about missing funds. This time, she hadn't counted on messing with a police chief's family. By afternoon, reporters gathered outside the station. Dad handled the press conference while I helped. Detective Martinez organized evidence for the district attorney. That's when we found the encrypted emails. Barbara had been sharing our neighbors' personal information with outside companies, selling data about their daily routines and vulnerabilities. The real HOA board members were shocked. They'd trusted Barbara to handle day-to-day operations and had no idea about the fake security force or missing money. One board member broke down crying when she realized she'd signed blank checks that Barbara used to fund her scheme. As evening approached, more residents came forward. The security team had been demanding cash payments to overlook violations. They'd threatened elderly residents with eviction, photographed teenage girls by the community pool, and followed kids walking home from school. Each story hit harder than the last. I sat in Dad's office until midnight, helping sort through evidence. The last document we found was a draft of Barbara's newest plan, installing cameras inside people's homes for proper compliance monitoring. She'd already ordered the equipment using HOA funds. Just as we were getting ready to leave, Dad's phone rang. The FBI wanted to take over the case. Barbara's operation wasn't just in our community. She had links to similar schemes across 3 states. What started as a simple HOA power trip had uncovered a nationwide criminal enterprise targeting neighborhoods. Looking at the mountain of evidence on Dad's desk, I thought about Sarah in our garden, the Patels tending their vegetables, and all our neighbors who'd lived in fear. Barbara hadn't just broken the law, she'd broken our community's trust. But as I read through more residents' statements, I realized something else. By working together to stop her, our neighborhood had grown stronger than ever. "There's something you need to see," my neighbor Tom whispered, pulling out his phone. My stomach dropped as I watched shaky footage of Barbara's security team surrounding the Rodriguez family's birthday party last month. In the video, kids were crying as the K-9 unit circled their bounce house, while Barbara stood in the background with a satisfied smirk. More neighbors started gathering on our lawn, each bringing their own evidence. Mrs. Patterson, an 80-year-old widow, showed us photos of security guards peering through her windows at night, claiming they were checking for unauthorized decorations. Her hands shook as she described being too scared to even water her flowers. The Patels brought out a detailed diary of harassment, daily photographs, fake violations, and even threats about their suspicious vegetable garden. They said growing too many tomatoes could be a code violation. Mr. Patel explained, his voice tight with anger. "We've lived here for 20 years, but last month they started calling our curry cooking a public nuisance." My dad's officers moved through the crowd, taking statements and collecting evidence. With each new story, Barbara seemed to physically shrink, her face growing paler. The security team stood handcuffed by the patrol cars, their fake badges and real weapons laid out on the hood for photos. Someone had started a group, chat sharing photos and videos of Barbara's reign of terror. The Jackson family had footage of the security team measuring their grass with rulers at 6 a.m. The Kowalskis shared emails, where Barbara threatened to put liens on their house for having a basketball hoop, one that had been there for 15 years. "Look at this," Dad said, showing me a document on his laptop. Barbara had been paying the security team from a secret HOA account, one hidden from the board and yearly audits. The amount made my eyes widen. Over $200,000 in just 6 months. No wonder our community pool hadn't been repaired. A news van pulled up, attracted by all the patrol cars. Barbara tried to hide her face, but her distinctive red power suit made her easy to spot. As the reporter started interviewing neighbors, more people drove in from nearby streets. Turns out Barbara's security team had been harassing people well beyond our HOA's boundaries. The Martinez family from 2 blocks over brought security, camera footage of the team trying to issue them citations. Even though they weren't even part of our HOA, the team had flashed badges and threatened to arrest their teenage son for skateboarding suspiciously. My dad pulled me aside, his face serious. "This goes deeper than we thought," he said quietly. "These guys have warrants in 3 counties for similar scams. They target communities with power-hungry HOA presidents, convince them they need special security, then use that authority to case houses for robberies." As the sun started setting, our street looked like a block party, if block parties had police evidence technicians and news reporters. Neighbors who had never spoken were hugging and crying together. Sarah brought out cold drinks for everyone, and the Rodriguez kids were finally able to finish their interrupted birthday party, this time with real police officers singing along. Barbara sat alone in the back of a patrol car, watching as her carefully constructed kingdom crumbled. Her phone kept buzzing, probably the real HOA board members seeing themselves on the evening news. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and investigations, but tonight, for the first time in years, our neighborhood felt like a real community again. Looking around at all the smiling faces and shared stories, I realized Barbara's biggest crime wasn't the fraud or the fake security force. It was stealing our community's trust in each other. As Dad always said, real security doesn't come from badges and uniforms. It comes from neighbors who look out for each other. My hands shook as I watched the real police officers put handcuffs on Barbara. Her face turned from its usual angry red to ghost white when they read her rights. The fake security team tried to run, but Dad's officers had already blocked every exit from our neighborhood. One of them even tried to hide in Mrs. Patterson's rose. Bushes that didn't end well. For anyone, especially the roses. The next morning, our street was packed with news vans. Reporters couldn't believe that an HOA president had created her own illegal police force. My phone kept buzzing with messages from friends sharing links to the story. Local HOA president arrested for running. Fake police operation was trending on every local news website. Dad called a community meeting at the police station. One by one, our neighbors stood up to tell their stories. The Rodriguez family showed videos of the fake officers threatening their kids for playing basketball after 6 p.m. The Patels shared photos of the security team writing fake tickets for their non-regulation mailbox height. Each story made the charges against Barbara more serious. But the biggest shock came when the police forensic accountant presented his findings. Barbara hadn't just hired illegal security. She'd stolen over $200,000 from our HOA, funds to pay for her private army. The money that should have gone to fixing the community, pool, and maintaining the playground had instead bought tactical gear and that poor German Shepherd. Speaking of the dog, we all got misty-eyed when the real K-9 unit officer told us how they'd rescued him. He'd been mistreated and poorly trained. Now he was going to a special program to be rehabilitated and maybe even become a real police dog someday. Dad let me visit him at the training center last week. He's already so much happier. The district attorney came to our next HOA meeting. She explained all the charges Barbara and her fake officers were facing: impersonating law enforcement, fraud, theft, intimidation, and civil rights violations. Some of the neighbors gasped when she said Barbara could face up to 15 years in prison. I caught myself feeling a little sorry for her until I remembered how she'd made Sarah cry. Then something amazing happened. People started sharing their old violation notices. Hundreds of them. We spread them out on tables in the community center, and a pattern emerged. Barbara had targeted specific families more than others, especially people of color and anyone who'd ever questioned her authority. The DA's eyes lit up when she saw this evidence of discrimination. The local newspaper ran a big story about how communities can protect themselves from HOA abuse. They interviewed Dad about the warning signs of fake security forces. Sarah got quoted about the importance of standing up to bullies, no matter what titles they give themselves. The reporter even mentioned our vegetable garden, the one that started this whole mess, as an example of reasonable homeowner rights. Last night, we had our first HOA board election since Barbara's arrest. The meeting room was packed. Even people who'd never come before showed up to vote. No one talked about lawn height regulations or mailbox colors. Instead, everyone discussed ideas for community improvements and ways to make our neighborhood more welcoming. The new board's first vote was to create a residents' bill of rights. No more surprise inspections. No more harassment. No more fake security forces. As I watched my neighbors sign the document, I noticed something had changed. People weren't afraid anymore. They were talking to each other, laughing, making plans for block parties and community projects. Barbara's lawyer tried to cut a deal, but the evidence was too strong. The DA said our community had set an example for the whole state. New laws were being proposed to prevent HOA overreach and protect homeowners' rights. Sarah got invited to testify at the state capitol about our experience. As we left the courthouse after Barbara's plea hearing, Dad put his arm around my shoulders. "You know what the best kind of justice is?" he asked. "The kind that brings people together instead of pushing them apart." Looking at our neighbors hugging and crying happy tears on the courthouse steps, I couldn't agree more. The moving trucks came for Barbara early on a misty Monday morning. I watched from our front porch as she supervised the loading of her precious lawn ornaments, the same ones she'd used to write up countless violations against other residents. Her face had aged 10 years since her arrest, and her signature "I'm in charge" stance had wilted into something smaller. My phone buzzed with a news alert. Former HOA president pleads guilty in private security scandal. The story had caught national attention, leading to investigations of similar HOA abuses across the country. Dad told me he'd received calls from police chiefs in 3 states, asking for advice on handling similar cases. Sarah came outside with 2 cups of coffee, smiling as she handed me one. "Remember when we were afraid to drink coffee in our own front yard?" she asked. She was right. Just a year ago, Barbara's fake security team would have written us up for loitering on our own property. The community garden we'd planted in place of Barbara's precious ornamental lawn was bursting with life. Mrs. Patterson, who once reported her neighbors for ethnic cooking smells, now traded homegrown tomatoes for Mrs. Patel's curry recipes. The Rodriguez kids, who used to rush inside when security drove by, taught everyone how to grow the best jalapenos. My dad stopped by every Sunday, not as police chief anymore, but as a proud father and grandfather-to-be. Sarah's baby bump was just starting to show, and the thought of raising our child in this transformed community filled me with hope. The same neighbors who once lived in fear of each other now brought us baby clothes and parenting advice. The new homeowners council met in the community center, where Barbara's wall of shame, covered in violation notices, had been replaced with photos of neighborhood events. Sarah, leading her first meeting as council president, introduced a revolutionary idea: using our budget for community programs instead of security patrols. Last week, a documentary crew interviewed us about the transformation. They captured footage of our monthly block party, where Officer Rodriguez, a real police officer, played basketball with the kids while parents grilled and shared stories. The producer couldn't believe this was the same community she'd read about in the news. Barbara's old security office became a community resource center. The gun safes and surveillance equipment were replaced with books, board games, and a coffee station. The only uniforms allowed inside were those worn by our community service volunteers, identifiable by their bright yellow neighbor helper vests. Yesterday I found an envelope in our mailbox. Inside was a letter from Barbara's daughter, who had moved her mother to a smaller house in another state. "Mom's starting therapy," she wrote. "Watching your community heal helped her realize she needs to heal too." Attached was a photo of Barbara at her new home, smiling genuinely for the first time in years as she worked in her own small garden. Standing here now, watching new families move into our neighborhood, I think about how close we came to losing everything good about community living. Sarah squeezes my hand as we watch kids from every background, playing freely in their front yards. No security cars in sight. The only sirens we hear nowadays are from the ice cream truck. And the only person checking on homes is Mrs. Patel, delivering her famous homemade naan to new neighbors. Our story made the cover of Community Living magazine this month. The headline read, "From Fear to Family: How One Neighborhood Overthrew Tyranny and Found True Security and Unity." But the real story isn't in the magazine. It's in the sound of laughter from the community garden, the smell of multicultural potluck dinners, and the sight of neighbors helping neighbors, no badges required. Dad says it best when new residents ask about our security system. The best security isn't in cameras or guards. It's in knowing and caring about your neighbors. As I watch the sun set over our transformed community, I realize Barbara's biggest fear came true. She lost control. But in losing control, we all found something much more valuable: freedom to be neighbors in the truest sense of the word.